displaced through the scourge of slavery or through the dishonesty of indentureship, and we're brought into this collective land, we lose that indigeneity and we lose the background of science and technology that would have sustained us because place does matter. Therefore, as a result, our concept of science and technology is a very Western concept. It is a Western European concept. It's very significantly Judeo Christian in its nature. It has been, it is a tradition which has been nurtured by, some may say, the hegemony of the church. And it is a tradition which hamstrings our ability as disparate peoples with a common future in a common landscape to really position ourselves. And what has been the journey to get here within a science and technology context? Now, many of us know Walter Rodney's book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. Our education system, our access to, our embrace of, our culturalization to science and technology has been significantly hamstrung and deliberately underdeveloped by our colonial masters. The Venerable Queen's College, of which I'm an alum, and perhaps many of you, I know Terence is as well, um, was a bastion of colonial existence where you either had to be a moneyed person among ex-slaves or indentured parents, or there were scantily just a few scholarships available. Because, of course, colonial power could not be maintained with an educated labor force when that labor force was the only jobs available to that labor force were menial jobs. And so our history, our journey has been a journey of underdevelopment in science and technology and a culturalization to only one concept of what science and technology really entails. And I think this is one of the major reasons why we haven't valued, for example, our own indigenous peoples here, who I firmly believe hold many of the solutions that plague us in this world where we're struggling with a developmental trajectory that's hamstrung by trade policies, that's hamstrung by cheap energy, that's hamstrung, yes, in Guyana we have a paucity of trained labor, and that's hamstrung, Charlie is right, by tremendous race issues that we still haven't learned how to deal with. Our journey has also been one of immigration. Our journey has been one where the ABC countries, the American, British, and Canadian countries, will take you as an immigrant if you have money to invest or if you have an advanced degree. In other words, those countries will take you if you have intellectual capital or financial capital. And so, because we have not been able to make a sufficiently clarion call to our educated, we all leave, and I'm one of those people. We all leave these shores because of whatever reasons that our walls can't contain us. The brain drain, therefore, is a significant issue in our journey. Let's not forget that after independence, like many other countries, and we need to recognize this when we examine our history, is that many of the steps or missteps that we have made aren't just peculiar to Guyana. These are steps and missteps that the newly independent nations all made. But we went on a nationalization spree like everybody else. And so most of the technocracy, which was an expatriate community, left. So we were suddenly inherited with industries that our people had not been encouraged to be trained to operate. And we all know what happened. Now we can go and debate that, but that's really been our history. We ended up with massive brain drains. We ended up with a technocracy that lives elsewhere. And we ended up with crumbling plants and machineries and spiraling inefficiencies, such as with Gaisuko, who still operates kilns for their systems that were built in 1930s and 1928. And Gaisuko will probably tell you we're still operating them. Well, they're operating them at efficiencies of about 58 to 60%. And there's no reason why they should be operational. So, in terms of science and technology, our trajectory and our journey has been one where we were underdeveloped, and then whatever little development we had left these shores. It is no secret that Guyanese professors inhabit the world's universities in numbers much larger than our per capita share would indicate. Terence is here, Dr. Cambridge is here, right? Dr. Charles hopefully is not leaving soon. Charlie Griffith has spent most of his life overseas. I spend most of my life overseas. So the evidence is quite empirical and quite staggering. Now, what can we become? So I'm going through the four questions. What can we become? What we can become is less a prescription than it is a question we must ask with respect to our particular bent. Our bent is conditioned by wanting to be like. We want to be like Western Europe. We want to be like North America. We want to be like somebody else. What we don't examine is the trajectories that those nations had to go through in order to be where they are, and what they have done to their environment. In many cases, and I will unashamedly say, in Canada and the United States, they've decimated and marginalized their indigenous peoples. And they exist in a world where they're looking towards places like Guyana for things like carbon credits. So, what we must not be is a carbon copy for development using technology so as to engage in unsustainable practices. I hear very worrying things that we're embracing. Well, I know we have a mega farm already that's been there for some time in the Rupununi. Well, no, we don't have a labor force in the Rupununi which can service the kinds of labor that mega farms require. And the labor force in the Rupununi are mainly indigenous who are not interested in a lifestyle of 9 to 5 labor on a mega farm, and whose sustenance comes from other things such as hunting and fishing and traditional ways of life. So, are we to pursue the mega farms a la what's happening in the Pantanal in Brazil, or what happens on the plains of Saskatchewan, where the groundwater is so contaminated with pesticides that there are massive issues with respect to drinking water? There are massive issues with regards to things like phthalate esters in the groundwater. The intensive feedlots have put so much antibiotics into the groundwater that men are now growing breasts because there's an overexpression of estrogen in our groundwater. And so we must pause and ask ourselves, with a population of 750,000, do we really need another mega farm in a fragile savanna? Has anybody ever done some research on the groundwater on this coast? We have a situation on this coast where our cane fields are contiguous to all of our populated peoples. And we have been blasting those cane fields with fertilizers for years and years and years. Charlie is right. We don't have a baseline. And we need those baselines to understand how we can change. So we need to look at other things. We need to look at pharmaceuticals using our rainforest base. We need to look at cosmetics. I have in my house two daughters, a wife, a mother, sometimes two nieces. There are a lot of women in my house. And I don't want, no disrespect to the ladies here, but we were moving once and the girls left, and me and my son had to pack the bathrooms up. And we had 18 different hair products, 27 different face products, and you don't want to know how many perfumes. Now, when I looked at the components of those products, they were all components that we have here, and we don't need to cut down our rainforests to get them. And they were much, much more expensive than the gasoline I put into my car. So, why would we spend our agriculture, for example, growing biofuels when we can grow cosmetics and sell it to the rest of the world? So we need to be careful of our agriculture. Flavors and fragrances and functional ingredients command a much higher price in today's world than commodities. And if at all we are to make commodities, then let us not be silly and ship those commodities without first adding value to them at home. In today's newspaper, it says that Coca-Cola is not making Coke in Venezuela anymore because they don't have sugar. So why we are very uncompetitive in the way we make sugar, but we exist in a CSME system with access to one of the largest confectionery eating markets in the entire world. And why isn't our sugar being turned into confections at home, taking advantage of the tax situation we have with CSME and therefore adding value to those commodities? The lesson is well learned. Producing commodities, you only win because it's a race to the bottom. The lowest producer wins. So, what can we become has to be related to sustainability. And we have to begin to examine that mega enterprises has never been the engine of growth of an economy. They've always been small and medium-sized enterprises that coalesce at the right time into large supply chain management systems. And so one of the things that we crucially need to look at is we need to enable credit. This country receives less than 0.01% of all foreign direct investment in the region. We need to address the lack of a venture capital culture here. And we need to examine also the lack of a manufacturing culture because our private sector tends to be mercantile. We like to buy things and sell things. And I know there are systemic issues around why we don't manufacture, like energy. But there are other things that we can do by realizing the innate value of our peculiar situation and what we can grow and what we can deliver. There are significant benefits to be had by avoiding the destructive trajectories of the Western European and North American model. How do we get there? Both Charlie and Elroy spoke about policy. And so without policy to guide us, I think that we are going to be bereft of direction. Let us face one salient fact. The political cycle of this and many other countries is far shorter than the cycle for solutions to our problems. And unless a country like ours embraces policy-driven governance, the vagaries of the political system means that we will always be at the mercy of ideology and changes in regard. We must engage the technocracy as little as small and as beleaguered as it is in this country. We must engage civic society. We must engage the church. And I mean, this is straight out of Charlie's presentation. And have a multi-stakeholder approach to crafting policies which can survive governments and which can transcend this shortened political cycle which all over the world government seems to saddle themselves with. We need to avoid wholesale transfer of technology. Appropriate technology is a very important phrase. Just because it works somewhere else doesn't mean that we have to have it here. We, case in point, if you have a large case of unemployment, you don't want to have parking garages which are automated. Technology must be a tool, it must not be an end. We need to invest in education. If it is alarming to me that of the percentages of students taking science subjects at the CXC, that percentage continues to dwindle. People like myself and my panelists, we have a great responsibility to ensure that students understand what they can be if they do science and technology and why this nation needs them. And Terence spoke about that because we need to provide entry points for STEM. And so I'm making, and I see that the Vice Chancellor has just arrived, so this is quite timely. I think clearly we need to invest in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. But as a scientist, I'm making a clarion call, not at the expense of the humanities, not at the expense of the arts. Think of the iPad. The iPad would be an expensive paperweight if the content for the iPad didn't come from the humanities. And so when we look at our world and the opportunities that avail themselves, scientists and technologists must be imbued with a sense of where we are from, where we're going. Societal is important in that pursuit, and being able to define what is appropriate. And so, again, a clarion call for multidisciplinarity as we invest in education. The other thing that we need to do are basic things that all governments will come to inevitably. Review of taxation structures to enable research and development investment by companies. This is basic, and all governments will inevitably get there. Perhaps we can nudge and push. And in a country like ours, with a paucity of investment dollars, with a non-existence of a venture capitalist system, it is very important for government to also invest in science and technology companies. Private and public partnerships are very important and useful tools if managed well to encourage companies to locate here, to use local and appropriate technology. And that will, of course, um, adduce to our collective benefit. I want to end with saying one thing. Neville Trotz was here earlier, but he isn't here now. We need to find our heroes and we need to celebrate them. Guyana has a very long and respectable history of producing remarkable scientists. Those people need to be held up to our kids as heroes of our community. People like Neville Trotz should be known by everyone because he's well known in the Caribbean and further afield, but our villagers don't know him. So let us celebrate our heroes and let us remember nobody likes a copycat. Think of ourselves. Thank you.
I want to thank all of the panelists, and I think we have enough time to open it up for questions. Perhaps just one more round of applause. I felt kind of slightly in awe of the gentleman. I think right here we have a reflection of the talent that Dr. Ryan talked about. So there are microphones, and we'll open up for questions.
Thank you. My question to Engineer Griffith is, he said that he looked at the possibility of the Demerara and the Bobbish River for deepwater harbors. Could you share your results with us, or would it be inappropriate? Which of the two rivers was the more appropriate?
Okay. I think before you can get to the sediments on the Barbies River, it's about 38 feet deep. And in Demerara, it's about 40, 42 feet deep before you hit rock. And that goes out to about between 10. On the Barbies River, you have to do close to 18. And in Demerara River, you have to do 15 miles before you hit the rock falls off. So to me, what one should do is to excavate that sediment about 200 feet wide and then go down to rock 10 feet. And so what will happen, even though you will have the deposition, you throw it off and it comes back, it would not be consolidated. And so any supertanker will pass through there if you have 4 or 5 supertankers a week. We'll just cover that. It's going to be expensive, but you need hydropower to... The excavators can be designed. They're going to have to run off of probably 500-600 horsepower motors. And booms about, a boom about close to about 80 feet. It can be done. It will take time, but it can be done. In other words, what I'm saying, it's a problem that is not a foreign problem, it's our problem. All these years. Let's solve it. Let's develop a hydrologic lab, especially to look at flow and deposition of sediments. And if you look at our rivers, that murkiness is really sediments moving, and when the velocity reduces to less than 1.5 foot per second, they're going to fall out, and then it's going to compact over years. So it's a problem, or we go upstream and create lakes on the riverbed, on the river stream itself, and trap the sediments up there. And just, to me, it's a problem that can be solved very easily because there's rock under 34, 35 feet. And so that's the way I look at it. And you may need to take the ramp, the bridge, maybe 2-3 miles out. Because supertankers, they're going to lift the elevation of the water inside. So that's the way I see it. The solution can be done. It can be done. We need to do some modeling. But I have, as an engineer, I have this idea. When James Watt built the steam engine, he knew nothing about thermodynamics. So we can do that if we don't want to build models. Flow and deposition of sediments in Guyana is a major problem. We don't have an hydraulic lab to look at it. We should.
Okay.
Thank you.
So that's the way I look at it.
Thanks. Thank you very much. I quite enjoyed all 3 presentations indeed. And so I can find a slew of questions for each of the presenters. But I'd like to ask Dr. Charles a question, and perhaps Dr. Suresh Narayan. Dr. Charles, taking into consideration your own recognition and ours that climate change is an impact negative on the coast, particularly in relation to agriculture, what are your views about moving towards climate resilient agriculture by looking for alternative lands through a process of agroforestry and then subsequently agro-processing? In other words, moving away from the coast, away from the coastal belt, a bit more inland, within defined watersheds, and opening up new agricultural lands through agroforestry. That's the forest and the agriculture going together. And then agro-processing, which provides employment and new products at the national level. What are your views on that?
I think those are excellent questions, actually. One has to consider as in the presentation that I made, one has to consider what we talk about, the quality of the land that we're referring to. The realistic idea is that most of our forested lands aren't arable land. I did mention, however, that we can deal with the non-arable land through we considered aspects of fertigation, the use of organic amendments and microbial technology in terms of improving the nutrient availability to plants. Because if you pay attention to our forested areas, a lot of the forested plants are in association with both endo and ectomycorrhizae, which makes nutrient available to particular plants. That's the phosphorus, as well as they are in association with what we call rhizobium. That's to give the nitrogen availability to particular plants. For the other nutrients, they become available when the other microbes decompose the organic matter, and that becomes available to particular plant. So yes, there's the opportunity for us to do that, but we have to replicate that kind of system within those particular area. For our coast, of course, we can still consider planting plants that can tolerate flooding. Rice is one of them. Our grasses, we can do that. So we can still plant those kinds of plant on the particular coast. We can look at other possibilities that Partners of America seems to be teaching lots of urban persons to do, that is containerized agriculture. So that even though you're flooded, your agriculture is done in particular containers, and it's not affected by the flooded water. As a result of that, you have more intense system and higher productivity within those particular areas. There is a consideration that could be done for flooded areas, especially knowing that we have issues with environmental contamination, especially for our sea areas or seawater, and may in future affect our fish stock. What we can consider is actually using coastal areas for aquaculture production. We have seen that in the number 19 areas, Berbice, where lots of farmers are doing aquaculture, but they are doing tilapia. Some of them are doing pacu. Others are trying hassa, right, for that. But yes, there are opportunities where we can use our inland areas for agriculture under agroforestry setting, or if we can replicate the kind of setting in forestry so that the plants can utilize the nutrients that can become available if we use organic amendments in those areas.
I may want to add, one of the problems in Guyana with plant nutrients, and this is information I gleaned when I was at the Central Agricultural Research Lab during the 70s, I saw science. In Guyana, there is not a lot of levee work to control flooding from the rivers. There's not a lot of levee work to make lands available for agriculture, to prevent leaching of nutrients. So we need to start like on the Mahaika River, where folks went and planted in the floodplain. You know, like in the Mississippi River, they made a whole massive amount of acreage of land available. And in Dallas, they had levees, and you create agricultural lands. In Abari, in Maiconi, in Maico, there are no significant levees. So you live on the floodplain, like the floodplain for the Demerara River. This is a floodplain until you go up to Enmore, and you go back to high flood. So I'm concerned about the Demerara River. If you have a temporal storm, it sits there for 3-4 days, and having about 12 hours a day, Georgetown will be 10 feet of water. That bothers me. So in most of these riverine areas, and in Rupununi, about 4 years ago, I looked at the River and the Rupununi River, and I was working on a 50 square mile agricultural, the Johnson's property outside of Good Hope. They have 50 square miles. But Zapkan, who was an agricultural soil scientist at Ministry of Agriculture, Central Agricultural Research Lab, before he died about 2 years ago, I spoke to him. He said, Charlie, all we had to do is to levy the thing. And that become good agricultural land. And there's another thing in Guyana that bothers me. People talk about drought. And when you dig down 3-4 feet to find water, and how can you talk about drought? Okay.
We will have one more question, and one more question or comment.
Be allowed to ask a question? I was the first person to raise my hand.
You have one more. You go first, and then we go.
Okay, so thank you very much for the presentations. I'm Dr. Hazel. I returned to Guyana about 2.5 years ago. And one of the first things that struck me is the fact that in science and engineering and in general, we produce a lot of intellectual property. So you talk about research, the products of research are usually valuable intellectual property. And so those of you who have hundreds of publications, if you have published an article in a foreign journal, one of the first things they ask you to do is to sign over your copyright to the journal. So you no longer own that material. And so you can't address the question of science and research in Guyana without, first of all, setting up the infrastructure so that we don't transfer this wealth to the United States and to the UK where these journals are based. Because when we try to access these journals, they want us to pay sometimes $35 per view, right? So it's a very important problem. We need to find ways to establish our own publication bodies and to retain our intellectual property within Guyana so that this wealth is not transferred abroad. I have other questions, but I think this is the most important one. I want to know if you have any ideas about how to get this started.
Yeah, I take a shot at that. You know, at the outset, I agree with you, but I also have some buts. I have a large portfolio of patents, probably 80, but I have given up maybe 60 because a patent is not worth anything unless it makes money because it costs you money. So it's very important when we talk about intellectual property that we understand intellectual property, and I see Dr. Monroe over there, who I'm sure will be able to correct, and Terrence as well. It depends on how many jurisdictions, of course, you have the patent in. But if you have a patent that's, let's say, Europe and North America, Canada, the US, and Europe, which tends to be the higher margin markets, and so most people will patent there. And because China seems not to really respect people's intellectual property, most people will not patent there. However, Over the course of the lifetime of patents, which are now 20 years, those patents will cost you about 250,000 US dollars to maintain. So unless they at least make 250,000 US dollars, you should not have it, right? So that said, the local patent legislation, I think the last time it was upgraded was 1946. It's very poor legislation, and our copyright laws in Guyana are also very poor. So not only are our intellectual property legislation not up to snuff, it's also very, very outdated. And our commercial court doesn't have a history of being able to handle patent litigation. Our country lags the Caribbean, actually. There's now a Jamaican patent office, and there are movements towards a Caribbean patent office. But we lag the rest of the region in this aspect. We have even, for example, lost the rights to own Demerara sugar. So we haven't even taken advantage of geographical indicators as a way of protecting intellectual property. So whilst I endorse the way, I'm advising caution that intellectual property portfolios cost money, and therefore they must make money. We also, in terms of publications, it's a double-edged sword, isn't it? We've got to be careful when we talk about only homegrown journals for publication, because it does limit the trajectory of a scientist in the global sense. And we can't be an island unto ourselves. We've got to participate in the global marketplace, the agora of ideas, so to speak. So I think these are worthwhile ideas to think about and move forward to, but with caution and with an understanding clearly of what it takes to actually own all these patents, and to, of course, owning a patent is only as good as your ability also to defend it. And so, I mean, I think we have 2 or 3 lawyers in town who dabble in patents, but we don't have a history here in Guyana of patent attorneys. And you'll very quickly learn when you're in that field that a good patent lawyer will cost you 600 US an hour, and they'll charge you for talking to you on the telephone, because it's about money, right? So I think we have to be careful, but I certainly endorse the call to look at this area.
So mindful of the time, we will ask the Vice Chancellor to give us the last word, and then I'll say just a few
It will
words.
also be a very brief word. Thank you, Dr. Blackman. I want to go back to something that Professor Narayan said, not only to endorse the importance of celebrating, even if only identifying first our heroes. And that is to say to you that what I said on campus on Sunday, I'll say now, some people were there on campus. I think the University of Guyana needs to be the place to start some of that. And so we'll be starting some of that. We'll be celebrating Trotsy. We'll be celebrating C.Y. Thomas. We'll be celebrating Sister Noel Meniz. We'll do those celebrations in stages. We'll first have a distinguished lecture in their name. There's a group of people working on each of those names, and then we'll find a way to move from the distinguished lecture to an endowed professorship. Now, the endowed professorship, as we all know, costs money. So the platitudes about wanting to celebrate have now got to be translated into practicality of putting the money where your mouth is. And what we'll be reaching to alums, to people in the world, in Guyana and outside of Guyana, to really put money where mouth is, to celebrate at least 3 people who, as you quite rightly said, are celebrated and recognized beyond Guyana shores. But we have not found a way, for a variety of reasons, to do that. But we'll start with C.Y. Thomas, Ulrich Trotz, and Noel Meniz.
So my official role in this context was to be the respondent, and I think that in some sense many of the themes of my response have already been echoed, so I won't try to be long. I'll try to add some small. I was recently reading a paper by a friend named Shingai Nagara, who's a South African, and his paper was around kind of looking at global economic history and trying to understand why Africa remains sort of, in quotes, underdeveloped. And it sort of contrasted Africa's strategies and progress with working models in other parts of the world. And central to that analysis was the discussion of the role of science and technology in economic development. And so in some sense, what I see our panel sort of kind of reprising in some way were some of the points that Chinga Ngar sort of made. And so I'll just reiterate them and seek not to kind of go through each of the presentations in turn. So I think there are 4 key points that emerge from our presentations. So the first one, and that was reflected in Dr. Nine's presentations, that the world is, and in the questions that were just raised, the world is an interconnected, globalized political economy which exhibits some really complicated behavior. And as such, sort of the relative wealth or poverty of Guyana will be attributed to a number of decisions and actions, and Professor Charles Griffith sort of in gory detail identified those kinds of actions which we need to be taking or not taking, that our sort of wealth or poverty will be attributed, will be a function of the decisions, the actions that we make, and not only our decisions and actions, but also the decisions and actions that are made in other parts of the world. And so hence the sort of mantra, maybe we ought to be doing cosmetics rather than doing sugar. And so we have to be cognizant in our scientific enterprise that we don't sit only in Guyana, but Guyana sits as part of South America, it sits as part of the Caribbean, it sits as part of this hemisphere, it sits in some particular place in the global structure. The second point which emerges, and this was something that came through all the presentations and then finally sort of amplified in Dr. Nine's presentation, was that, you know, often the advice that comes from sort of, quote, the Washington consensus is perhaps not the most appropriate thing if we actually look at the histories of the United States and China and India and Brazil, is that there has been significant state involvement in the developmental strategies in the scientific enterprise. And we should be very cautious before opening up our agricultural lands to trade, that we begin to think seriously about the value-added components that we need to do in order to more effectively compete in that world. The third point, and I think this came through very clearly in both of the presentations of Dr. Griffith and Dr. Charles, and I think it's, if there's something to take away, I would like this to be taken away, is that these advances in science and technology lead to advances in levels of industrialization, which sort of creates goods and services that kind of stimulate broad aggregate consumer demand at reasonable prices while lifting the standard of living. So I think in Dr. Elroy Charles's, I mean, you know, he gave us an exhaustive list of the agricultural activities, vegetables, root crops, plantains, bananas, fruits, and pointed out the ways in which the production had either increased or decreased and the consequences thereof. And so it's immediately clear to us that not only is it important for us to see kind of advances in science, but the converse is also true. So as was evidenced by I think one of the slides pointed out that in the sugar economy, we went from 334,000 tons to 232,000 tons. So when the science and technology is stifled, a vicious cycle that goes in the other direction sort of comes to play, right? So you get a loss of investment capital, you get a loss of, so the issues of credit were talked about, so a loss of profitability, diminishing industrialization. So this was also mentioned in terms of the brain drain. We have less people who can do these things that we want done. And the lack of availability of goods and services, so more importation to meet more importation to meet the sort of consumer demands, thus kind of, I think, perpetuating this kind of underdevelopment that we're attempting to break out from. And then I think the final point that I will say as part of this is, this goes to the end of Dr. Ryan's presentation. Said, you know, I suppose in some sense he was asking kind of like, what is the Guyanese renaissance in science and technology that is being imagined by the three folks here? And I think I think all of the participants, but I think this was amplified in the final presentation, sort of, let's look, yeah, this Guyanese renaissance in science and technology will not occur unless Guyana, and so someone mentioned explicitly questions of postgraduate, you know, so understanding that having a bachelor's degree is good, but you're just learning the basic things there. Having a master's degree is a little better, but you're still not in the business of creating new knowledge. Having a PhD, you've probably created like the first bit of new knowledge. And so we need to have some things in our country that are at the postdoctoral level. And I think the point that was made was that, and it was also made in Professor Charles Griffith's presentation, in reference to his reference to the amount of money that our government will spend on research and development. So the thing is that unless we make an intentional effort to be an actor at the sort of cutting edges in the advances of science and technology, then we're not going to see this Guyanese renaissance. It's not enough to have bachelor's degrees and master's degrees, but we have to have a place where folks who have doctoral degrees do the kind of work that is necessary in this context. And then the last and the very last point, I think this requires the development of kind of holistic, I think the word was used, and a kind of strategic thrust that has as a sort of strategic driver the recognition of our indigenous knowledge systems, right? So the history of us as indigenous peoples coming to Guyana from many different places and kind of somehow finding ways within our science, technology, and mathematics, but I will also add something else, finding something within that context to tap into our history, our histories as peoples, and in particular, our indigenous histories as peoples. This is perhaps the value add that we can add to our scientific enterprise. And then the final point, which I wanted to make, was I think there was very strong recognition within this context of our indigeneity, of recognizing that the arts play a significant role in our imagination, and ultimately science is a business about curiosity and imagination. And so as we deal with curricular issues which were mentioned in the talk, I think this panel rightly kind of makes a call for the importance to not just do STEM education, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, but perhaps what we need is STEAM education, science, technology, engineering, the arts, and mathematics. And so I'll pause there and thank you.
I want to give recognition to this young man. Here's your slide.
So
this is amazing. Each one of those cells give 1 volt.
Nice.
For about 25 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Griffith.
Each one of those cells give 1 volt for about 25 seconds. It's the same thing with the motor car engine and the piston. You know what you're playing with there? And that is only 6 feet. Each one of those cells give 1 volt.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
and
you.
This is a young man, Mr. Speestan, Mr. Arnold, who's worked for us to get that. Thank you.
Thank you. Clearly, the future is in good hands. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. At this point in time, we've got to press the pause button. Pause until New York, when we continue this conversation. We had a lot, we've been exposed to a lot.
I think it was pointed out that the folks who are gathered here are not just pointy-headed, pie-in-the-sky academics, but people who are involved in the very serious application of knowledge, generation of knowledge, and applying it to real challenges. So at this point in time, we need a summary. Where is it we've gone in our conversation so far? So we have with us the Rapporteur General for this symposium, Dr. Nigel Graves-Zandy. So Nigel, will you in very short term give us your summary of where we've gone to in this conversation?
Thank you very much. One of the issues that we reflected in the documentation coming out of this is that after 50 years, we are not able to manage our time properly. And a session that should have been concluded at 5 o'clock is now wrapping up at 6:45. It was on the 24th of May, 1738. Today is the 24th of May. A governor of the colonies of Demerara and Essequibo, I believe his name is Lawrence Storm Vance Graves-Zandy, in a dispatch to the Dutch West India Company, remarked that the colonies of Demerara and Essequibo hold the greatest promise for the development of all sectors in the New World. And he continues, let us not squander this opportunity, for history will hold us accountable and judge us harshly if we merely talk and do nothing. End of quote. Words of the governor of Essequibo and Demerara, Lawrence Storm Vance Graves-Zandy, in a dispatch today, 24th of May, 1738. And we need to ask ourselves, how relevant was that letter to the Dutch West India Company in today's context? 50 years. We're celebrating the Golden Jubilee. And this National Symposium series seeks to reflect, in large measure, where we are, Guyana at 50, understanding our independence journey. The report will reflect that over 2 days, we had interesting and instructive intellectual conversation here in Georgetown, and one to come in June, York College in New York. The report must reflect the hard work put in by the organizers, including but not limited to the Academic Working Group of the National Commemoration Commission in Guyana here, the Symposium Subcommittee of New York, the Guyana Cultural Association of New York, Inc., and the University of Guyana. Some acknowledgement of the sterling contributions of Dr. Ivelaw Griffith, Dr. Vincent Cambridge, and Dr. Kimani Nahusi as chairpersons and co-chairpersons, working the Academic Working Group for the National Commemoration Commission. Here in Georgetown, being former Vice Chancellor of the University of Guyana, Dr. James Rose. The document will state clearly and remind us of the objectives, essentially to facilitate cross-disciplinary conversation on 4 interrelated questions, and to recall that those questions are: who are we? What has been our journey? What can we become? And how will we get there? The documentation will reflect a very impressive opening session and will record that the welcome and closing remarks would have been done by fourth formers of Queen's College and Bishop's High School, respectively, interspersed with cultural presentations and remarks by the chairperson, Professor Ivelaw Griffith, using as a central theme The words of Martin, poet, I come from the nigger yard. The government's remarks and endorsement would have been brought to us by the Minister of Culture, Youth and Sport, Honorable Nicolette Henry, who used the opportunity of the opening of this symposium to reaffirm the importance of the theme chosen, to recall the relevance of the 4 questions posited, and urge that as a nation, we ought to celebrate our collective achievements, while emphasizing that the post-colonial period was perhaps one of missed opportunities in some respects, but that we had an opportunity as we move to the next 50 years to ensure that self-determination has not been achieved, but that must never elude us as a united people with a common destiny. That the opportunity to create unity in diversity must be the sine qua non as we proceed in the next 50 years. Over the last 2 days, we listened. On day 1, for example, we listened to 8 presentations involving 31 presenters. The areas of focus traced our past and our contemporary history, deliberating on areas of governance, the role of the print, electronic, and social media in this journey. Touch of Guyanese philosophy, security and sovereignty, partitioning and race relations, made known public through the writings of Brother U.C. Guyana. The journey of a son to Great Britain on issues surrounding mental health, alcohol, a concept entitled New Authoritarianism, Science and Technology, Social, Economic, and Political Perspectives on Race in Guyana. The Youth Speaks, ended with Drums and Rhythms, the Heartbeat of Our Nation. Arising out of those presentations, instructive and pertinent questions, gaps were filled, and recommendations made. As we left the auditorium, we were reminded of how interlinked our culture is to our history as we listen to the drums and rhythms. Day 2 today saw 11 presentations done by 40 presenters. And the areas of focus: music creativity in the post-independence years, instructive engagements on gender and development in Guyana, issues of food security, nutrition, economic development, public health, the challenges posed in the area of security to Venezuela's expansionist role, multicultural food consumption, and matters pertaining to drainage and irrigation were compelling. The decline of the typical village economy and how this could be resurrected in the context of self-reliance, society, religion, values, decolonization, the requirements for just and caring society, matters pertaining to economy and governance, and the allocation of our human capital being positioned for economic performance. Instructive session was on the repositioning of Guyana's premier tertiary institution, the University of Guyana, for national development. And that session focused essentially on financing tertiary education, governance, and quality operation services an agenda for immediate action, not today, not tomorrow, but today. The session that we just listened to, science and technology's role in defining Guyana's trajectory, then, now, and what must be that technology. Issues pertaining to sustainability, innovation, and entrepreneurship were central themes in all of the presentations that we listened. What were some of the common themes and issues in that conversation? One, recognition of our collective achievements in past 50 years. Two, that ours is a nation of outstanding potential, natural resources, human capital, but there was need for greater level of transparency and accountability at all levels of society. We heard a common theme of the challenges of self-determination, political intrusion that infested and affected our developmental thrust during this period. In explaining the four questions, other issues and gaps would have been identified. The need was clear that we have, as we move forward, to build a culture of trust and national cohesion. That we need to work towards a sustainable national development strategy that was all-inclusive and stakeholder-driven if it were to achieve sustainability. The way forward, as reflected in some of the questions and answers coming, was to ensure that there be a comprehensive report of the symposium, both in Georgetown and New York, that reflected as an annex every single presentation that would have been made, and that this can be part of our historiography intended to be used by policymakers, not exclusively government, but policymakers in the private sector, civil society, academia, media, in helping to fashion and inform policy. And I believe, summing up, was an instructive comment made by one of the presenters. Words of Nelson Mandela from his prison cell, that this new paradigm shift has got to start with the process of education. And quoted Mandela saying, and I quote, "Education is the great engine of personal development. No nation should avoid that element of its development." The period must be set for enacting and embracing some core values in every sphere of life in Guyana, and that together we must work to eradicate the culture of mistrust and inculcate a sense of national pride, excellence, and good governance. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Dr. Gravesandi. As I said, the pause button has been pressed. It will be reset in New York on June the 5th. Thank you very much. I wish there were a bar here that I could say, come and have a drink on Terry. But ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Let's extend our deep appreciation to the management of the Arthur Chung Convention Center. And let us also extend a hearty round of applause to the Guyana Learning Channel, without whose help we could not have been streaming this to the world. Thank you very much, Guyana Learning Channel. Okay, there it goes. Thank you.
Hey, nice meeting you, man. Hey, young man, nice meeting you. We're old people. You guys are the young ones. Yeah, the last entomologist, Frederick Jones, and I studied at school together.
Jones moved to the
Yeah, he gave us in Kitchener.